What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. So, it occurred to me the other day that we are something like 3 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, out from the finishing or the conclusion of the Button story arc from DC Comics. And I was like, oh my God, that gives us like no time to do the Watchmen and everything. Because I was like, geez, we got to cover the Watchmen and then we got to be able to do the Button story arc once we get to it. And I was like, well, if we're going to do this, like we're going to go for broke, right? Like we got to cover all this stuff. So we're going to cover before the Watchmen and then pick up with the Watchmen. Now, in truth, I'm actually kind of jumping in with the last story because I kind of feel like Dr. Manhattan is really the most popular character for a lot of people coming out of the Watchmen, or at the very least, one of the most recognized. I would say that, you know, Rorschach's really popular too, and I love Rorschach as a character, but before Watchmen, I love this series. Like, I love Before Watchmen. I love the Dr. Manhattan segment. I really feel like it kind of adds to his character, and it creates something pretty interesting with regards to him and how he functions and things like that. So the funny thing about this is that Before Watchmen is largely just a DC thing. Instead of it being an Alan Moore thing, it's really a DC thing. I know it's created like a lot of polarizing things, and like traditional Watchmen fans will be like, no, if it's not done by Alan Moore, it doesn't count, you know, that's fine. But the fact remains here that I love it for what it is. Like, I love this whole idea of exploring in depth, basically the origins and the lives of these different characters before they ever became part of the Watchmen, before the Watchmen was traditionally formed. And so what this does is it picks up with the childhood of John Osterman, the childhood of Dr. Manhattan. And the cool thing is that he actually gives us this little bit of an explanation about Schrodinger's cat, which is basically a hypothetical quantum physics scenario whereby if a box is closed, then there's no way for you to know what's inside the box. Now, that's a very, you know, shorthanded, simplified version. It's a lot more complicated than that, but we don't need to get into quantum physics in this video in order to understand Dr. Manhattan. The point that he's basically making here is that for every possibility that exists, there's an infinite number of possibilities. And so if you have a box sitting in front of you and you can't see what's in front of the box, the possibility exists that there's a cat inside the box. But if the possibility exists there's a cat inside the box, then the possibility exists that there's an infinite number of other things inside the box. So there's nothing in the box. There's a dog in the box. There's a miniature human inside the box. Any number of things that could be in there. And so again, this is really just kind of designed to play at the idea that as far as Manhattan is aware, his life was on a preordained path for him to become Dr. Manhattan. A time was going to come when Osterman was going to enter the intrinsic field. He was going to be locked in, the machine would activate, and he would be stuck, and he would eventually be, you know, disintegrated in its entirety, restore himself on the molecular level, and go forward hitherto as a god within the realm of the universe in terms of, you know, the Watchmen comics. And so the cool thing about this is that he's also given a clock by his father. And this is very reminiscent of the base of operations of Dr. Manhattan that we're familiar with from the Watchmen landscape. So it's pretty cool to kind of see how these little bits and bobs, these little pieces begin to come together. But one of the aspects, and really one of the things that John had received out of a Cracker Jack box, was this little blue figurine. And the indication seems to be here, this is why he reconstituted himself as a guy who was blue. He basically just modeled himself after something that he already knew. Now that begs the question, why didn't he make himself look the way he did before? But the cool thing here is that he's basically just kind of looking at two different scenarios, looking at two different situations. And initially, this really kind of jumps forward a bit. It kind of goes back and forth in terms of time, but it jumps forward to the point at which the Minutemen are basically retiring. They're starting to walk away, and the Watchmen, or the predecessor to the Watchmen, is being formed. And so what John is, or I guess really what Manhattan is basically saying here, is that he himself had somehow engineered or changed his own history, changed his own past. Now, again, this is something that's kind of fleshed out over the course of the story, and the reason I say that is we jump back to when he was younger. Now, the funny thing about this is that this is basically us being shown how rigid and structured Osterman was when he was a normal human being, in the sense that he's basically obsessed with watches. Now, it's not really like watches themselves that he's obsessed with, it's what they represent. That watches are fixed, watches are reliable, watches are guaranteed to follow a form and function, and they never deviate from that function. You know, for example, if you had a watch, you know, you wouldn't suddenly look at your watch and it's 3:05 and then look at your watch 5 minutes later and it's 3:55. That's not going to happen. And if it does, then somebody's messed with time, is all that is. So watches simply are just cogs that just turn, you know, on a guaranteed path. Seconds go by, minutes go by, hours go by, and their form always stays the same. The funny thing about this is that a really attractive woman is like, hey, look, you know, a bunch of us, you know, we're gonna to go out and we're going to go have a good time. I told them you would go. They said you wouldn't because you're so rigid and structured, but just come out, have fun, enjoy life, allow yourself to be spontaneous. John's response is no, I don't want to do that because I need to finish this. And so it's really designed to show us how obsessive he is with the nature of his life, how obsessive he is with the structure and order of things. And he even commentates on that, symmetry, order, control. It's all about control. Now this jumps to 1959 at Gilliflats or Jalaflats. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, but it's basically the introduction of Wally into the Watchmen landscape. Now we know Wally, of course, as one of the guys that John had worked alongside for quite some time alongside Jeannie. And, they were basically genius scientists and that kind of thing. And it led to him becoming where he is, but it's basically just kind of showing us the early days of who he was. But the funny thing about this is that as his younger self, really that is to say, when he was first becoming a part of this experiment, one of the things he does is he comments on this sort of foreboding feeling, this idea that he senses a presence. Now, this is one of the funny things about this is because what Manhattan basically establishes here is that his younger self cannot sense his future godlike self, but he knows that something's there. Something seems a little off. He's able to sense another presence. And so this is kind of funny because we know Manhattan can kind of travel back and forth through time, but in terms of how he impacts people in the past, that was always something that was kind of interesting. And so what we know here, at least what we find out here, is that neither Wally nor John can sense his future self. Instead, his future self can see them in the past, but they can't really interact, or at least not really interact directly. Now, that also begs the question, if he chose to, can he interact with his younger self? And we'll actually find out that he ends up doing something that sort of sets things awry. But following this, it really kind of follows this form and fashion with regards to Dr. Manhattan, first meeting Silk Spectre, that kind of thing, with the Watchmen, with Night Owl and the Watchmen more or less forming into an actual group, with Manhattan basically manipulating things a little bit so that he and Silk Spectre would basically learn more about each other, and they would eventually begin to fall in love. Now, again, this is really him kind of commenting on how things could have been, about new possibilities being created. That, where he was paired up with Rorschach, things have changed now. He's paired up with Silk Spectre. Where Silk Spectre and Night Owl became a thing for a while, or at least where he was always kind of chasing after her, that Manhattan and Silk Spectre ended up falling in love. It's all these different possibilities, all these different directions things could have gone in. So again, it's really kind of cool because we get this sort of fast track of these different situations, which is to say, the idea that the Minutemen, or what's left of the Minutemen, are basically breaking away. Jeannie leaving him, Dr. Manhattan falling in love with Silk Spectre, the two of them getting together, the idea of Richard Nixon, the whole 9 yards, the Watchmen being born. So again, it's kind of cool to see these things unfold. But the last little tidbit here in this little section, it's simply the idea that that John had entered the intrinsic, or I guess been locked inside the intrinsic field. He'd been dissolved and he was effectively killed, or at least believed to have been killed. Of course, his father gets the news here. Now, again, the funny thing is that when he basically goes to visit his father, the idea here is that his father can see him. Now, again, this is Manhattan in the past. This is him, kind of hidden back from the world, but it's also him encountering his father. And so because of that, his old man is very much like, oh my God, they took them from me, that kind of thing. So it's really showing us how the world sees Manhattan, in the sense that where some people look at him and say, oh my God, this is a God among us. We have to work with him because we can't do anything to stop him. Others looked at Manhattan and said, this guy is a travesty. This guy's a sham. Something's wrong here. This guy is not who he's supposed to be. This guy's dangerous, that kind of thing. And so because of that, what ends up happening here is that we sort of follow John at the moment when he goes back in time, or I guess Manhattan at the moment that he goes back in time and follows himself to witness the intrinsic field incident take place. But what ends up happening here is that instead of being trapped in there, John goes in, gets his coat, and leaves with 4 seconds to spare. The machine activates and he never becomes Dr. Manhattan. And so the question that's being asked here is, why? What is it that happened that he never became Manhattan anyway? And so following this, it really just sort of follows his life, this new life that he has where he's not Manhattan. And the new life is actually pretty interesting. He and Jeannie, of course, follow the path of getting married. Things are still relatively similar, but the goal here is to basically show how things could have been, how things could have unfolded, what things could have looked like. And so the great thing is that we sort of get this these two juxtapositions in terms of what the world is supposed to be like, that is to say, the world of the Watchmen that we know versus how the world should have been, or at least how the world could have been. And so we get basically these scenarios where things are side by side, is the best way I know how to describe it. For example, there's an instance where there's a statement that's made by the news, and the president basically denies sending CIA troops on aircraft carriers for the purpose of overseeing the entirety of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, to sidetrack for a second, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a multifaceted thing. I mean, there were a lot of things that stemmed into it, but a lot of it was really kind of rooted in 1961, maybe 1959, when the United States and Turkey worked out a deal, because Turkey was part of NATO, when the US and Turkey worked out a deal where the US was able to put missiles in Turkey. In response, we ended up having the US again trying to curb communism, different things like that. You had the Bay of Pigs and so on and so forth. But as a result of that calamity, the USSR viewed President Kennedy as being weak and indecisive. And so in response, they put missiles in Turkey, and that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, that's a very, simplified explanation, and it doesn't need to be wildly complicated. But for the context of this story, the news is basically saying, well, the president is avidly denying that he sent any kind of CIA operatives or anything along those lines. Another scenario plays out where the president confirms that he sent Ozymandias to join the aircraft carriers and to oversee operations in the Gulf. And so we basically see these two different situations play out. The first one is the CIA operative, the comedian. And the comedian takes a far more heavy-handed approach, where instead of being like Ozymandias and being more intelligent, the comedian is very gung-ho. He's very, let's just shoot everything up, call it a day, done is done. This leads to a complete and total calamity, and the world is engulfed in nuclear war. On the other hand, Ozymandias takes a more enlightened approach. He says, instead of just fighting this out, let's talk this out. Messages are relayed, and the world does not find itself embroiled in an entire state of nuclear holocaust. And so again, following this, it continues to give us this sort of back and forth. In one scenario where the comedian was the one who assassinated President John F. Kennedy for the CIA while stationed out on the grassy knoll, another guy was arrested. In one instance where President Reagan had basically told Gorbachev to tear down that wall, Richard Nixon is sworn in for a third term and eventually becomes what seems to be a permanent president of the United States. So again, it's really interesting to see these sort of things juxtapose against one another, how things are versus how things could have been. The Watchmen universe as we know it versus the Watchmen universe where it could have been a wholly different scenario and a different situation played out in its entirety. And so what ends up happening here is that with Manhattan basically witnessing all these different things unfolding now versus the way that he remembers them unfolding, what basically takes place is he realizes that he's done something somewhere to change the past. He's basically altered his reality instead of it being the way it's supposed to be. Now, the reason why this is so important is because of the fact that we look at Manhattan as just this godlike guy, and indeed he is. I mean, he's a guy that can basically manipulate all things in existence. All of reality are baubles in his hand to play with. But John is still learning about his powers to a degree. He's learning the impact he can have. And so what's essentially taken place here is he goes back to the idea of the Schrodinger's cat and basically says, okay, look, if there's this box that is my life, and inside this box is the Watchmen universe as it unfolded, but I haven't done anything to look into it, which is to say, I haven't gone back to look at things before my experiment or, before I became Dr. Manhattan, and even after that time, then the possibility also exists that any number of other different scenarios could be inside that box. And so in a sense, he's basically split the entire universe into divergent realities. There's any number of scenarios that could be unfolding here. And so he's basically created a multiverse. And that's what's so interesting about this, is because it's this idea that it basically goes back to the concept of paradoxes. If he goes back into the past and he changes things so he never becomes Dr. Manhattan, then how could he be Dr. Manhattan going into the past to witness himself to change things? And so again, it's just like alternate realities in Marvel Comics, alternate realities in DC Comics. It's the idea of invoking a situation that by virtue of just going back and changing things, he's created divergent realities. He's created alternate realities. And so what he ends up doing is saying, okay, look, I have to go back and I have to find a way to essentially change all these things back. Now, it's not a wildly complicated thing, right? I mean, don't take this to mean that he's just a guy who's a goof and has no idea what he's doing and just kind of screwing things up. He knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly what moments he has to change. But what he does is he sort of strays away for a second, and it's actually DC offering a little bit of an expansion on his origin in terms of where he comes from and what his family's about. And the reason why is because in the original Watchmen comic, it was basically just believed that Dr. Manhattan was just an American. I mean, that was really it. But what ends up happening here is we get this little bit of a story where we find out that his mother was a German Jew, that his father was a German. And so because of this, the people around them in their local, village, their local town, didn't take too kindly to the idea of Manhattan's father marrying a Jew. And so because of this, in the moment when the Nazis began to seize power and began the process of rounding up Jews, John's father and his mother basically bailed out of there and took John with them. Now, the cool thing about this was that the idea was to basically keep John hidden, which is exactly what they did. But this all really goes towards the idea of a greater self-sacrifice, which is to say, making the sacrifices necessary in order to ensure things are the way they're supposed to be. And what I mean by that is, in this scenario, when John's mother and father are basically riding along and they're eventually spotted by the Germans, John's mother just jumps off and runs away, but she serves as a distraction, so the Germans will go after her and they won't ask any other questions. The father instead is able to take out all of these these soldiers, but John's mother dies in the process. The reason why this is important is because of the fact that this again represents the idea of sacrifice. While John, while Manhattan isn't really, killing Nazis or anything like that, what he's doing is killing universes. And the reason why is because in his mind, yes, there's all these different universes where he stayed himself. There's all these different universes where he had a perfect life, but it's not how things are supposed to be. It's not the way things are supposed to function. And so because of that, he basically has to allow these universes to die in order to make sure that the one true universe lives. It's juxtaposed to the actions of his mother, sacrificing her life to make sure that John can live. Now, the reason why I think this is so important and the reason why I bring this up is because of the fact that this mindset of Manhattan fits in perfectly with DC Comics right now, right? Like it fits in perfect with DC Rebirth. If Manhattan is taking this stance that there should only ever be one universe, the universe where the timeline follows a preordained path, where it was supposed to be a certain way, somebody went back and changed something, if that's the mindset that he has, that action of change has to be eliminated, then it would be perfectly plausible for, the Watchmen to have basically been rolled in or to have been there all along or something along those lines, for Manhattan to have seen the actions of Barry Allen going back in time during the Flashpoint event and initiating the start of the New 52. Manhattan would take that response and say, no, Barry Allen went back in time and changed things. He was not supposed to do that. I'm going to fix everything he's done. That could easily play into this equation right now. Now, we don't really know. I mean, at this point, it's anybody's guess in terms of what role Dr. Manhattan's going to have within the greater DC Rebirth. But the cool thing about this is that Manhattan begins going back and essentially resetting all these moments, setting things to the way they were supposed to be. And so the origin of himself, as we know from the Watchmen story, basically begins to come to fruition in the sense that he and Jenny share a beer, their hands touch, the two start going, they start dating, they become pretty serious, that kind of thing. But the other half of this is the question, when he becomes Dr. Manhattan, why is it he continues to have some measure of a nervous feeling? Why is it he continues to not be able to see things the way that he's supposed to? Now, what this does is tie into the main Watchmen story itself, where Manhattan was basically kind of parading around saying, hey, look, the future is a little fuzzier than it should be. I can't see things perfectly. I can't see beyond the moment when I traveled back, different things like that. And so again, it's basically kind of like this static or this fuzz. And so because of this, he actually goes to see Ozymandias. Now, again, this basically leads directly into the Watchmen when we end up finding out that with Manhattan essentially killing Rorschach, this was all engineered by Ozymandias himself. That in the Watchmen story, it wasn't as though Ozymandias had just presented a really logical scenario to Dr. Manhattan and then said, hey, look, man, like here's, it's all for the greater good, right? Manhattan said, yeah, I think you're right. It went back further than that, that the manipulations of Ozymandias weren't just copying the power of Dr. Manhattan, it was copying the power of Dr. Manhattan and then subtly leading Dr. Manhattan to believe that it was the right decision all along. Now, of course, we know by virtue of the Watchmen story, that was it. I mean, it was the huge revelation that Ozymandias had basically initiated the countdown and the destruction of these major cities before Manhattan or Rorschach or anybody even showed up there. So that was one of the huge drops. But the idea here is that, again, it goes back to this notion that Ozymandias had been manipulating everything the entire time. So again, it's kind of a cool little bit of explanation here, a cool little bit of expansion in the sense that when Ozymandias says, hey, look, man, like you are pure energy in its most basic form. You are effectively one with the universe. Now, if the world could experience an hitherto unseen era of peace, all based on you, just because of the fact that the energy that makes up who you are would allow for unlimited resources, resource wars wouldn't exist. There'd be no more reason for conflict. We could reduce the reason for humanity to engage in war with one another. Would you say yes? And Manhattan's response is, of course. If using my energies or if replicating my energies means making the world a better place, then of course I'm down with that. Then of course that's a good thing. Now, of course, again, we knew this was Ozymandias basically using the power of Dr. Manhattan for the purpose of obliterating cities, all over the place, in order for humanity to basically come together to essentially say, hey, look, we have to work together to make the world a better place. It was all for the greater good. This follows almost immediately after that. Of course, Manhattan basically takes off to another galaxy, essentially just kind of leaves and goes and does his own thing. So we don't get a super in-depth explanation here in terms of what he does next. All we know is that he really seems to legitimately create life. And that really seems to be about it. I mean, things wrap up pretty fast. But again, I really enjoy Before the Watchmen. I absolutely love Before the Watchmen. I feel like the Dr. Manhattan story is one of the more complicated ones. I feel like all the other ones are a lot more simplistic. The reason why is because of the fact that Manhattan is so devoid from humanity that even when he references things, it isn't a very monotone, very stiff, very here's the facts, very, straightforward. There's not much in the way of vibrancy there. So it's really kind of interesting. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.